Have you ever been treated as a burden by your own family, simply because you dared to be honest? This story begins with such a woman, Clara Hartley, the youngest daughter branded as the ugly one, the family shame, just because she refused to stay silent when faced with lies. When her family received a marriage proposal from a wealthy rancher, they didn't send their prettiest daughter, they sent Clara as a cruel joke to rid themselves of the child they could never control. But imagine this if you were that girl sent hundreds of miles away to marry a stranger, carrying only humiliation and heartbreak. What would you do? Hide your pain? Or find the courage to reclaim your worth out in the wild heart of Wyoming, where the wind cuts cold and the land runs fierce? A man named Elias Monroe was waiting. He didn't know that the unwanted bride he was about to meet would become the one person he'd been searching for all along. Will this unexpected love be her redemption, or just another cruel test in a world that never played fair? And can a woman once cast aside find the one thing she's never known, peace within her own heart? If you believe that sometimes the most wounded souls are the ones who bring the brightest light, then this story is for you. Stay with us, like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, and let's begin a journey into a love that rose from dust and defied every expectation. The morning the letter arrived, frost still silvered the fence rails along Monroe Creek Ranch. Elias Monroe stood on his porch with a mug of black coffee and the kind of silence that made a man hear his own heart. Beyond the barn, a thin mist floated over the valley, hiding the cottonwoods that marked the creek, when the rider handed him a wax-sealed envelope bearing the Hartley family crest. Elias felt the first tremor of something he couldn't name. He had written to Charles Hartley only 3 weeks earlier, an inquiry more practical than romantic. He'd heard the man had daughters of marrying age and that the youngest was still unspoken for. Elias had thought it time, perhaps past time, to bring a woman into his quiet house. A ranch, no matter how large, had a way of echoing too loud when a man lived alone. He broke the seal with his thumb. The letter smelled faintly of rose oil, though the words were dry and formal. "Mr. Monroe," it began, "your proposal is received with gratitude. Our youngest, Miss Clara Hartley, will depart Willow Bend in 2 weeks' time. We trust you will find her temperament suitable to a life of hard work and moral steadiness. See, Hartley. No mention of affection, no hint of excitement a father might feel for his daughter's new beginning. Just temperament suitable." Elias read it twice, then set it down on the kitchen table beside his coffee tin. "Temperament suitable," he muttered. The phrase landed heavy in the air, like dust on sunlight. He remembered meeting the Hartley family once at the summer fair in Willow Bend. The 2 older sisters, Margaret and Louise, had drawn stares with their painted smiles and perfect curls. Their laughter had carried clear across the corral, but the youngest, the quiet one in a plain blue dress, he had noticed her kneeling beside a spooked mare, whispering until the animal calmed. Her hair had come loose, her hands were scratched, and mud streaked the hem of her dress. Still, she'd looked more alive than anyone else in that crowd of polished people. That was Clara Hartley, and if the letter truly meant she was coming here. Then, life on Monroe Creek Ranch was about to change in ways Elias couldn't yet see. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket. The paper felt too light to carry so much weight. Inside the house, the ticking clock sounded louder than usual. He looked around the single-room cabin, plank floor swept clean. Rifle on the wall, table worn smooth from years of elbows. A man could live a lifetime with such simplicity and still miss something he couldn't name. Elias had been alone 5 years, since the fever took Ruth. Folks in town said he'd turned into the quietest man in Wyoming territory. He didn't argue. Maybe they were right, but there were nights when even silence began to ache. Now, holding that letter, he felt both hope and unease wrestle in his chest. "Clara Hartley," he said aloud, testing the sound. The syllables felt soft against the rough air. That afternoon he found himself cleaning the house with unfamiliar energy. He scrubbed the stove top, replaced the worn curtain over the small window, even polished the silver buckle of Ruth's old saddle that hung by the door. It wasn't vanity, it was preparation. A man invited a stranger into his life. The least he could do was offer her something better than dust. By dusk, the light turned amber across the fields. Elias stepped outside, watching the horizon swallow the sun. The cattle moved slow in the lower pasture, their shadows long and thin. Somewhere far down the road lay Willow Bend and the girl who was said to be plain. He tried to imagine her face again, the steady eyes, the calm hands on that frightened mare. If she was the same woman, he thought. Plain was the wrong word entirely. He didn't know that miles away, in the grand Hartley house, laughter was echoing over supper. He didn't know that the same letter he held had been read aloud between sneers and jokes. He didn't know that Clara herself was listening outside a closed door, heart twisting as her family decided her fate. All he knew was that Thursday week, a wagon would crest the ridge and bring him a wife chosen by strangers and perhaps chosen for reasons no man would wish. He turned the lantern wick down low and looked once more at the empty second chair by the hearth. "We'll see," he murmured. "Maybe it's time this house had a voice besides mine." Outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of coyotes. The letter rested on the mantel, its wax seal glinting in the lamplight, an ordinary piece of paper that had just rewritten 2 lonely destinies. The Hartley home stood like a proud relic at the edge of Willow Bend, its tall windows gleaming with light even when most of the town slept. That night, the lamps burned bright in the dining room, and the clink of silver spoons mingled with laughter that wasn't kind. Charles Hartley sat at the head of the table, reading aloud from the letter that had come from Monroe Creek Ranch. His voice carried a weight of satisfaction, like a man reading a business deal that had gone his way. "Our youngest, Miss Clara Hartley." He read and paused to glance at his wife. "Seems Mr. Monroe doesn't care much about appearances. A practical man, I'd say." Marianne Hartley laughed softly, a sound sharp as cracked glass. Practical indeed. Imagine a man of his stature asking for a wife by mail, either desperate or blind. Louise, the middle daughter, fanned herself lazily, or both. Poor Mr. Monroe. He'll think he's getting a sweet country rose and find himself with a weed. Margaret smirked. "It's perfect. Let him have Clara. She's been a shadow in this house for too long. Perhaps she'll learn silence suits her." Their laughter filled the room again, bouncing off the polished walls and the crystal chandelier. Outside that laughter, beyond the hall and the heavy door, Clara Hartley stood motionless. The chill of the corridor seeped through her thin sleeves. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She had come to bring her grandmother a cup of tea, only to freeze at the sound of her name. Now she stood, every word slicing deeper. Her father's tone was smug, her mother's amused, her sisters cruel in their delight. They spoke of her not as a daughter or sister, but as a problem neatly solved. Charles folded the letter and tapped it against his palm. "It settles many matters," he said. "Elias Monroe is a man of standing, owns near 200 acres by the creek, and is said to keep his books as clean as his conscience. A respectable match, even for the plain one." "Plain," Louise repeated with a half-smile. "That's generous." Marianne's face, painted in lamplight, softened just enough to seem almost wistful. "I'll sleep easier knowing she's gone. Every time that girl opens her mouth, she endangers us. You remember the business with the surveyor last spring?" Margaret leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, yes. When she told Reverend Pike that Father's numbers didn't match the land deed, she nearly ruined me," Charles snapped, though his anger carried more fear than fury. "A daughter who questions her own family's dealings. What man can tolerate such a mouth under his roof?" Marianne placed a manicured hand over his. "No man should have to. Mr. Monroe will soon learn what he's taken on, and by then it will be too late." The laughter returned low and satisfied. Clara didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until the hallway began to blur. She turned, moving quietly down the passage until she reached the back door. Cold air hit her face as she stepped outside into the night. The sky above Willow Bend was wide and clear, a scattering of stars sharp as broken glass. Her breath came in small visible clouds. The words still echoed in her mind. Plain, burden, problem to be solved. She pressed a hand to her chest, as if she could still her heart that way. A faint creak behind her made her turn. Her grandmother's frail figure stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped tight around narrow shoulders. "Clara," the old woman said softly, "come inside. It's too cold for you out here." Clara forced a smile. "I needed a little air. Grandma," the woman's eyes, clouded with age but still knowing, lingered on her face. "I heard them," she said simply. Clara swallowed hard. "Then you know I won't argue." Her grandmother nodded. "You never do." They sat together on the small bench under the kitchen window. The smell of wood smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying memories Clara didn't want to hold. "I always hoped they'd see what I see," the old woman said after a moment. "Your father only knows numbers, your mother only mirrors, but you, child, you see things that others look away from." Clara looked down at her hands rougher than her sister's, more like a servant's. "They call it meddling, then meddle, if that's what it takes to live honest." For a long time they sat without words, listening to the wind move through the garden fence. Inside the house, the laughter had died down, replaced by the muffled murmur of plans being made. When the old woman finally rose, she laid a trembling hand on Clara's cheek. "Don't let bitterness root in you, girl. Let them send you where they will. The road you travel may turn into your salvation." That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her trunk sat open at the foot of her bed, empty except for a folded shawl and a small wooden cross. Through the window, she could see the moon sliding behind a thin veil of cloud. She thought about the man whose letter had caused such amusement downstairs. Elias Monroe. She knew little of him beyond rumor: a widower, hard-working, decent by most accounts. The kind of man who mended his own fences and spoke more to horses than people. What sort of life waited for her at his ranch? A loveless one, perhaps, but free of the daily sting of mockery. Freedom had its price, but she was willing to pay. When dawn broke, the house smelled of coffee and bread. Her sisters were at the table, their voices sugar-sweet. Charles cleared his throat. "Clara," he said, not meeting her eyes, "you'll be leaving Thursday morning. Mr. Monroe has sent a man and wagon. You'll pack lightly." "Yes, Father," she said quietly. Her mother added without looking up, "See that you wear something decent for the journey. There's no reason to shame us further." Clara's lips tightened, but she only nodded. Later, as she packed her few things, she found herself pausing over an old sketchbook, pages filled with pencil drawings of the land beyond Willow Bend, hills, rivers, wild horses. She slipped it into her trunk, a secret piece of herself she wasn't willing to leave behind. When the wagon rolled up 3 days later, the family gathered on the porch to watch. Louise dabbed at her eyes theatrically. Margaret smiled a smile meant for gossiping neighbors. "Be sure to write," her mother said. "I will," Clara replied, though she knew she never would. She climbed into the wagon seat, her small trunk beside her. As the driver clucked the reins, she looked once more at the house, its bright windows, its cold perfection, and then turned her gaze toward the open road. The town grew smaller behind her until it was only a smudge of roofs against the pale horizon. Ahead lay a land she'd never seen, and a man whose name already sounded like distance. Yet beneath the ache of betrayal, a faint spark of something else stirred in her chest. Hope, maybe, or simply the belief that somewhere beyond all this cruelty, her life might finally belong to her. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. She drew her shawl tighter and whispered to the empty road, "Let's see where honesty takes me." The wagon rattled over the frozen road, every jolt echoing through Clara's bones. Wind swept across the open plains, sharp with the scent of pine and snow not far off. She pulled her shawl tighter, though the cold wasn't what truly made her shiver. It was the knowledge that behind her, everything familiar had ended. The driver was an older man named Harlan Pike, sent by Elias Monroe himself. His hands, rough and knotted from years of reins and rope, held the leather straps with quiet skill. They had spoken little since dawn. Harlan wasn't unkind, only cautious, as though afraid words might startle the silence between them. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to melt the thin frost on the grass. Clara watched the landscape roll past dry sagebrush, dark ridges, the occasional hawk circling above. It was a harsher beauty than she had ever known, vast enough to make her feel both small and strangely free. After several miles, Harlan cleared his throat. "You're quiet, miss. Folks from Willow Bend usually can't hold their tongues that long." Clara smiled faintly. Perhaps they ran out of things worth saying. Harlan chuckled. "Fair enough." He flicked the reins, urging the horses onward. "You ever met Mr. Monroe?" "No," she said. "Only heard of him." "Good man," Harlan replied after a pause. "Hard worker, doesn't waste breath on what don't matter. Been alone too long, if you ask me. That ranch could use laughter again." The words caught her unexpectedly. Laughter in her parents' house. Laughter had always been sharp-edged, something that cut rather than healed. She turned her face toward the horizon to hide the ache that rose in her throat. Around noon, they stopped by a creek where ice still clung to the edges of the water. Harlan tended the horses while Clara unwrapped the bread and cheese she'd packed. The air was so still she could hear the faint trickle beneath the frozen surface. She ate quietly, then reached into her trunk for the small sketchbook she'd hidden at the bottom. Her fingers traced the worn cover before she opened it. Pencil drawings filled the page's willow trees, her grandmother's hands, the distant ridge beyond Willow Bend. She turned to a blank page and began to draw the shape of the road ahead, the wagon's wheels carving twin lines through the dust. Her pencil moved slowly, each stroke steadying her heart. Harlan watched from where he crouched near the horses. "You draw real well," he said. Clara smiled. "Closing the book, it helps me see things more clearly." He nodded, then looked up at the sky. "Storm might roll in tomorrow. We'll stay the night at Carter's Mill, last stop before Monroe Creek. You'll like it there. Decent folks." They reached the mill by dusk. It wasn't much a weathered building beside the river, its wheel creaking slow in the current, but light shone warmly from the windows. A woman with gray-streaked hair met them at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Evening, Harlan. Who's the young lady, Miss Hartley?" Harlan said. "Bound for Monroe Creek." The woman's expression softened. "Then you'll be wanting supper. Come in, dear." The mill house smelled of wood smoke and stew. They sat around the hearth, and for the first time in days, Clara felt something like safety. The woman, Mrs. Carter, asked gentle questions, nothing intrusive, where she was from, whether she liked the plains. "I'm still learning to like them," Clara admitted. Mrs. Carter smiled. "Give it time. The land has a way of testing you first. Then it lets you belong." Later. As Clara lay in the small loft room under a patchwork quilt, the wind whispered outside the window. She thought of her grandmother's words, "Don't let bitterness root in you." The road had begun to wash that bitterness away, mile by mile, yet beneath the peace of exhaustion, her mind kept circling back to the name Elias Monroe. What kind of man wrote such a brief, formal letter? What did he expect from a wife chosen by convenience and rumor? She imagined a tall man with steady eyes, hands rough from years of work. Perhaps a loneliness he didn't admit. But imagination could only take her so far. Tomorrow, she would see the truth. At dawn, Harlan's voice called up the stairs. "Time to move. Miss Hartley will reach the ranch by sundown." The air was crisp and clean as they set out again. Frost gleamed on the grass, catching the first gold of sunrise. Clara pulled her bonnet low to shield her face from the glare. The road wound upward through rolling hills, then opened into a wide valley where the land stretched unbroken to the horizon. "Monroe Creek runs just beyond those cottonwoods," Harlan said, pointing ahead. "That's where your new life starts. Her new life." The words both comforted and frightened her. By afternoon, clouds began to gather thick gray, heavy with snow. The horses quickened their pace, hooves striking sparks on frozen stones. Clara could feel the storm's breath in the air, cold and urgent. When they finally crested a ridge, Harlan pulled the reins and gestured below. There, Monroe Creek Ranch. Clara followed his gaze and her breath caught. Nestled in the valley stood a sturdy ranch house of pine logs and stone, smoke curling from its chimney. Fenced pastures spread out on both sides, dotted with grazing cattle. A river cut through the land, glinting silver in the weak sunlight. It wasn't grand, but it was alive, a place built by hands that cared about more than appearances. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Harlan smiled. "Ain't it just, mister? Monroe's done well for himself." They descended the slope slowly, wagon wheels grinding through patches of half-frozen mud. As they neared the yard, a figure stepped out from the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, coat dusted with straw. Even from a distance, Clara could see the way he moved, steady, deliberate, no rush in him. "That'll be him," Harlan said quietly. Elias Monroe stood watching as the wagon rolled to a stop. The cold wind tugged at his dark hair. His face was lean, weathered, and kind in a way that didn't need words. Harlan tipped his hat. "Brought your bride, Mr. Monroe." Elias nodded once, then turned his gaze to Clara. For a moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to narrow to the crunch of boots on gravel, the steam of the horse's breath, and the faint beating of her heart. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, his voice low and even. "Welcome to Monroe Creek." She met his eyes, unsure what she'd expected, pity, perhaps, or indifference, but what she found there was curiosity, quiet and genuine. "Thank you, Mr. Monroe," she said softly. "It's good to be here." He offered his hand to help her down. His grip was firm, warm despite the cold. For the first time in years, Clara felt a steadiness that wasn't born of duty or fear, just presence. As she followed him toward the house, the wind carried the smell of pine and hay. Snow began to fall, thin flakes swirling in the air like a promise. Behind them, the wagon turned back toward the road. Ahead, the door of the ranch house stood open, golden light spilling onto the porch. Whatever lay inside that light, kindness or disappointment, loneliness or love, Clara knew she would face it with her head held high. The plains stretched silent behind her, the storm rising in the distance, and for the first time in her life she didn't feel like someone being sent away. She felt like someone arriving. The snow began to fall thicker as Elias led Clara up the porch steps. The wooden boards creaked under their boots, and the faint smell of pine smoke and stew drifted from inside the house. The lantern by the door cast a warm circle of light, softening the sharp chill of the wind. Elias pushed open the door and stepped aside for her. "Come in," he said. "You've had a long road." Clara hesitated for a moment on the threshold. The inside was simpler than she had imagined. Bare wood floors, a stone hearth glowing with low fire, shelves lined with books and tin mugs. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. Every corner seemed to bear the mark of use and care. "It's warm," she murmured, unpinning her bonnet. Elias nodded. "I kept the fire going. Harlan said the weather might turn." He took her small trunk and set it near the stairs. "You'll have the back room for now. You can change there, rest if you need to." "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. While she unpacked, she listened to the sounds of him moving through the house, the creak of the floorboards, the gentle clatter of dishes. There was something steady and comforting in the rhythm of it. When she returned, he had set the table for two. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, and the smell of thyme and onions filled the room. He gestured for her to sit. "It's just venison and potatoes," he said, almost apologetically. "Nothing fancy." "It smells wonderful," she replied, meaning it. They ate in companionable silence at first. The only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the clink of spoons against bowls. Clara noticed how he ate slowly, almost methodically, as though his thoughts were somewhere else. At last he looked up. "You've come a long way, Miss Hartley. The road from Willow Bend isn't kind in this weather." "It wasn't," she said, "but it was quiet. I needed that." He studied her for a moment. "Quiet can be good," he said, "but too much of it can turn on a man. Or a woman." Clara smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it's time this house heard another voice." Something flickered in his eyes' surprise, then something warmer. "Perhaps it is," he said. After supper, he offered her coffee. The strong, bitter scent filled the small room as he poured it into two mismatched mugs. They sat by the hearth, firelight moving across their faces. "Tell me about Willow Bend," he said. Clara's fingers tightened around the mug. "There isn't much to tell," she said after a pause. "It's a town that loves appearances more than truth. I wasn't very good at either. Truth is rarer than gold these days," Elias said, "but it's worth more." She looked at him, half expecting irony, but his tone held only quiet conviction. "Most folks don't think so," she said softly. "Most folks haven't lived through loss," he replied, staring into the fire. "That changes what matters." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that lives between two people who understand what not to say. When she rose to go to her room, he stood as well. "I'll be up early to check the fences," he said. "Snow can weigh them down overnight. You can sleep in. There's no rush." "Thank you," she said again. Before she could turn away, he added quietly, "You did well to come. I know it wasn't easy." She met his gaze. "No, but I think it was right." When she closed her door, and the warmth of his words lingered in her chest like the last ember of a dying fire. That night, Clara dreamed of horses running through snow and of a man's steady hands guiding them home. The next morning dawned gray and silent. The storm had passed, leaving a thin crust of frost on the grass. When Clara stepped outside, the world smelled new, like clean air and pine sap. Elias was already in the pasture, hammering a loose fence rail back into place. He looked up as she approached. "Mornin'," he said. "Mornin'," she replied. "Can I help?" He hesitated, then handed her a pair of gloves from his pocket. "Hold this steady," he said, nodding toward the post. She pressed it firm while he drove the nail in with swift, sure strokes. "You've done this before," she said, "too many times to count." He smiled slightly. "You've got a good grip. I grew up fixing what my family broke," she said without thinking. Then she caught herself, but he didn't press. He only nodded, as if he understood more than she had said. By noon, the sun had thawed most of the frost. They worked side by side in silence, her shawl catching bits of straw, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. When they returned to the house, she washed her hands at the pump while he stacked wood by the hearth. She found herself watching him the way he moved with quiet confidence, how his hands seemed to belong to the tools they held. There was strength in him, but also restraint. A man who never used more force than needed. Over lunch, he asked about her interests, and she spoke of sketching, of drawing the land and the animals. He listened, genuinely curious. "You'll have plenty to draw here," he said. "Every bend in the creek looks different come morning." In the afternoon, while he rode out to check the north pasture, she explored the house. It was simple, but each object seemed to carry memory: an old locket on the mantel, a quilt folded with care, a pair of women's riding gloves tucked into a drawer. She guessed they had belonged to his late wife and felt a pang of tenderness she didn't expect. When Elias returned that evening, snow dusted his shoulders. He looked tired but content. "Cattle are fine," he said, shrugging off his coat. "I think we'll have a calm night." "I'm glad," she said. Then, after a moment, "Mr. Monroe, Elias, do you ever get used to being alone?" He studied her face, the firelight catching in his eyes. "No," he said finally. You just learn to carry it without letting it crush you. Clara nodded slowly. I think I understand. He smiled then, the kind of small, real smile that comes from shared understanding. You might, he said. You've got that same look, like someone who's learned to keep standing, no matter what comes. She felt warmth rise to her face, a quiet pride blooming where shame used to live. That night, as the wind moved through the pines outside, the house no longer seemed quite so empty. The two of them sat by the fire again, and when Elias poured her coffee, their hands brushed briefly. Neither pulled away. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was gentle, filled with something unspoken but alive. When Clara finally went to bed, she looked around the small room, the quilt, the wooden chair, the faint glow from the dying fire through the open door, and thought, this doesn't feel like exile anymore. Outside, the snow fell again, soft and endless, covering the tracks that led from Willow Bend. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel forgotten. She felt found. Winter arrived for real the week after Clara's first supper at Monroe Creek Ranch. The mornings turned white, and the creek behind the house froze in slow, glittering patterns. Each dawn began with the same soft hush, the kind that made sound itself feel sacred. Elias rose early every morning, the crunch of his boots marking the start of each day. Clara followed soon after, wrapping herself in her shawl and lighting the stove before he came back from the barn. It became their rhythm, silent but sure, like two melodies that found harmony by accident. The ranch hands from neighboring farms sometimes stopped by to help cut wood or deliver supplies, but otherwise they lived in quiet seclusion. To Clara, it felt as though the rest of the world had been buried under the snow, leaving only this small patch of life between her and Elias. One morning, as they ate breakfast, she noticed him pause over his coffee, lost in thought. You ever miss the noise? She asked. He looked up, puzzled. Noise, people, she said, smiling faintly. Town chatter, gossip, bells ringing, horses clattering down Main Street. Elias shook his head. Noise don't mean company. I've had enough of noise. I'd rather have quiet, that means something. His words warmed her more than the fire. Later that day, they worked together repairing a section of the barn roof that had buckled under snow. The sky was clear, pale blue stretched wide as eternity. Elias held the ladder steady while she handed him nails. Her breath came out in soft, white clouds, and for the first time in weeks, she laughed aloud when a gust of wind blew her bonnet clean off. Elias caught it before it hit the ground. The plains have a mean sense of humor, he said, grinning as he handed it back. The grin startled her. It changed his face entirely. Gone was the solemn rancher. For a fleeting moment, he looked boyish, alive in a way she hadn't seen before. When the repairs were done, he motioned toward the corral. You ever ride? I've been on horses, she said carefully, but I can't say they've ever truly wanted me there. He chuckled. Then you've just never met the right one. He opened the gate and let out a dappled mare with a dark mane and soft eyes. Her name's Juniper. She's gentle, but she likes to be asked, not told. Clara stroked the horse's muzzle. Like most living things, she murmured. He watched her quietly as she mounted, her skirt tucked neatly to the side. She rode awkwardly at first, but Juniper seemed to sense her hesitance and slowed her pace. Elias walked beside them, one hand on the bridle, his voice calm and instructive. Lean into her rhythm, he said, She'll find yours if you let her." After a few minutes, Clara relaxed, feeling the mare's motion steady beneath her. The wind brushed her cheeks, cold and pure, for a brief, impossible moment. She forgot everything her family's cruelty, the reasons she'd been sent here, and felt only freedom. When she looked down at Elias, he was smiling again, not at her, but with her. That evening, they ate by the fire, both still pink-cheeked from the cold. She spoke more than usual, telling him stories of her grandmother, of sketching by candlelight, of the willow tree behind her old home where she used to hide from her sister's laughter. Elias listened, silent but intent, as if every word mattered. When she finished, he said, "You know, most folks would have turned bitter after all that. But you don't sound bitter." Clara looked into the fire. "Bitterness is like a splinter. Mr. Monroe, you can live with it a long time, but it festers until you pull it out." He nodded slowly. "And have you pulled yours out?" "Not yet," she said softly. "But I'm learning how." He didn't press further. Instead, he reached behind him and brought out a small wooden box. "I meant to give you this earlier," he said, opening it to reveal a set of charcoal pencils and paper. "Found them in town last month. Thought you might like to keep sketching." Her breath caught. For me, he shrugged, trying to hide the warmth in his voice. "Seemed like something worth having. You make the place look better just by noticing it." The words touched her deeper than he could have known. She traced the edge of the paper with her fingertips, blinking back sudden tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "No one's ever given me something just because they thought I'd like it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, it's about time someone did. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in her small room, the new pencils in her lap, sketching the outline of the barn under moonlight. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the glass like silent confessions. When she finally went to bed, she realized something had shifted not in the house, but inside her. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Days passed into weeks. The snow deepened, and life settled into a peaceful rhythm. They shared chores, meals, small talk, and quiet silences that grew comfortable. Sometimes, when he returned from the pastures at dusk, she would already have the fire lit and stew simmering, and he'd stop at the door just long enough to say, "Feels good coming home." One afternoon, she ventured into town alone to fetch supplies. People watched her curiously, the plain girl from the Hartley family who'd married into solitude. The gossip reached her ears before she left the general store. "Poor thing," one woman whispered. "He only wanted her for convenience. Can't imagine why he'd settle for that one." Another said, "Maybe he's blind, like they say." Clara paid for her flour and tea, thanked the shopkeeper, and left without a word. But the sting followed her all the way home. When Elias found her later that evening stacking firewood with shaking hands, he asked quietly, "What happened?" She hesitated, then said, "People have long memories. They like to remind you of where you came from." Elias leaned his shoulder against the post beside her. "Let 'em talk. You're not what they say." She met his gaze, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Then what am I?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and brushed a lock of hair from her face, his touch light, respectful. "You're what's honest," he said finally. "And that's rarer than beauty. Clara." Something in his tone made her heart catch. The air between them shifted, fragile and alive. But before she could reply, he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Come inside before you freeze," he said, his voice returning to its steady calm. She followed him in, but her thoughts stayed outside with the wind. His words replayed again and again, simple, unpolished, but truer than any compliment she'd ever known. Later, as they sat by the fire, their eyes met briefly. Neither spoke, but both knew something had begun, something small and cautious, yet unstoppable as spring beneath the snow. The next morning dawned gray and heavy. Clouds hung low over Monroe Creek like a secret waiting to be told. Clara stood by the window, watching snow drift past the glass in slow spirals. The world outside was wrapped in silence, but inside her chest, her thoughts churned restlessly. Elias had left before sunrise to check the southern pasture. He hadn't said much after their quiet evening by the fire, but the memory of his words, "You're what's honest," echoed louder than any farewell. She wondered if he regretted saying it, or if he had meant it as deeply as it had sounded. By midday, she went about her chores as usual, feeding Juniper, mending a tear in one of Elias's shirts, preparing bread dough. Yet everything felt sharper, more alive, as though each simple act carried a pulse beneath it. When the front door opened hours later, the wind rushed in first, scattering loose snow across the floor. Elias stepped inside, shaking frost from his coat. His cheeks were red, his eyes bright with cold. "Storm's coming tonight," he said, "a hard one." Clara looked up from kneading dough. "Are we prepared?" He nodded, hanging his coat by the fire. "Mostly. I brought the cattle in close. The barn'll hold." He paused, his gaze softening as it met hers. "You've been busy." She smiled faintly. "It helps the hours pass." He walked to the table, leaning slightly against it, his gloves still in his hands. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt charged, thick with things unsaid. Then he said quietly, "You shouldn't let what people in town said trouble you." Clara's hands stilled on the dough. "You heard. Word gets around," he admitted. "They don't know you." Her throat tightened. "They don't need to. They've already decided what to believe." Elias took a slow breath, his gaze steady on her. "Then maybe you should stop trying to prove them wrong." She frowned, unsure whether to be angry or grateful. "And do what?" "Then just live," he said simply. "Let the truth of who you are speak for itself." Something in his voice, firm, quiet, almost tender, broke through her defenses. She looked away, blinking hard, then said softly, "That's easy for someone like you." He tilted his head. "Someone like me, someone who's respected," she said, "who's built something, who belongs." Elias looked down, the faintest shadow crossing his face. "You think I belong here?" She hesitated. "Don't you?" He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low, rougher than before. "My wife died 2 winters ago. I spent a year trying to make this house look like it still had life in it. The truth is, I've been living like a ghost since the day she left." Clara froze. He'd never spoken of her before. Elias looked toward the fire, his jaw tense. Her name was Mary Ann. She was kind, full of laughter. Everyone in the town adored her. When she passed, folks pitied me, but pity isn't the same as belonging. They just didn't know how to talk to a man who kept waking up to an empty room. The quiet that followed was thick and tender, filled with something deeper than sympathy. Clara's heart ached for him, not just for his loss, but for the weight of silence he'd carried since. "I'm sorry," she said finally. He shook his head. "You don't need to be." His eyes met hers, warm and searching. "You've brought more life back to this house in 3 weeks than I managed in 2 years." Her breath caught. She tried to speak, but couldn't find words that wouldn't tremble. "Instead," she said softly, "the bread's ready to bake." Elias smiled faintly. "Then let's not let it burn." They worked side by side in the small kitchen, the rhythm of ordinary life grounding them again. But when the bread came out of the oven, the smell filled the room with such comfort that Clara nearly laughed from the sheer humanness of it, the warmth, the simplicity, the healing hidden in a loaf of bread shared between two lonely souls. That night, the storm came as promised. The wind howled through the canyons, rattling shutters and shaking the roof. Elias checked the fire, then added another log. "It'll be bad until morning," he said. "I'll stay up." Clara offered, just in case. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll rest a while, but wake me if anything shifts." Hours passed. Snow whipped against the windows in wild gusts. Clara sat near the fire, a quilt over her knees, sketching by lantern light. Her pencil traced the curve of the mountains, the angle of the porch roof, the memory of Elias's quiet smile. She didn't hear him wake, but when she looked up, he was standing by the hearth, watching her. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Not with that wind," he said softly. "You draw beautifully." She flushed. "It's only a habit. It's more than that," he said. "You see things other people miss." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade. Only the crackle of the fire and the slow rhythm of their breathing remained. Then, without thinking, Elias reached forward and brushed a curl from her forehead. His fingers were warm, calloused, careful. She didn't pull away. "Clara," he said quietly, "I don't know what this is becoming between us. I didn't plan it. I wasn't looking for it. But I haven't felt this peace in a long time." Her heart pounded in her chest. "Nor I," she whispered. "But perhaps peace is what we both needed." He smiled then, soft and real. "Maybe so." The storm raged on through the night, but the house held strong. When morning finally came, the world outside lay buried in deep white silence. Clara opened the door and stepped onto the porch, her breath catching at the sight. The valley below shimmered like glass, every branch coated in ice, every fence post shining. Elias joined her, his coat thrown over her shoulders without a word. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's alive," he replied. "Even under all that cold, life finds its way back." She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Just like us." He looked at her, then not as the girl sent to him by others. Not as a duty or arrangement, but as someone who had walked quietly into his solitude and made it something worth sharing. And, though neither said it aloud, they both knew something had changed forever. The silence between them wasn't lonely anymore. It was a promise. When spring finally came to Monroe Creek, it didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in slowly, snow melting into the earth, the creek loosening its icy grip, small buds daring to push through the cold soil. Clara noticed it first in the air, softer somehow, carrying the faintest hint of wet grass and pine sap. Elias had been quieter since the night of the storm, not distant, exactly more watchful, as if weighing something he wasn't ready to name. They worked together as always, fixing fences and clearing debris from the pastures. But there was a new current beneath every shared glance and every accidental touch. One morning, As Clara spread feed for the chickens, she saw Elias by the barn, speaking with a stranger on horseback. The man's clothes were too fine for a rancher, and his horse gleamed like polished silver. Even from a distance, something about him unsettled her. When the man left, riding back toward the main road, Elias came to find her. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried that careful weight she was beginning to recognize. "Who was that?" she asked. "Russell Dean," he said. "Lawyer out of Willow Bend. Said he's been looking for you." Clara stiffened. For me, Elias nodded slowly. "Your family's in trouble. Land disputes, something about forged contracts and missing money. He said your father wants to see you." Her hands went cold, even in the warm air. "My father wants to see me." "Now," she whispered. After sending me off like a parcel he couldn't wait to be rid of, Elias's voice softened. "You don't owe him anything, Clara, but I thought you should know." She turned away, the sunlight flashing across her eyes. "It seems I never stop paying for other people's wrongs." For the rest of the day, she moved through her chores like a ghost. The past she thought she'd left behind was reaching for her again, its grasp as cold as the winter that had nearly broken her. That night, as she sat by the fire, Elias approached quietly. "You're thinking about leaving," he said. She didn't deny it. "He's still my father. Whatever he's done, I can't ignore it. But part of me fears if I go back, I'll never find my way here again." Elias crouched beside her, his eyes level with hers. "Then don't go alone." She looked at him, startled. "You'd come with me if you'll have me," he said simply. "Not to interfere, just to stand beside you." The offer struck something deep within her, a place that had long forgotten what it felt like to be protected, not controlled. "Thank you," she whispered. "But I think I have to face them myself. If I don't, I'll always be the girl who ran away from her own name." Elias studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I'll wait here, and if you don't come back by the new moon, I'll come find you." Her throat tightened. "You have a stubborn streak, Mr. Monroe." He smiled, faint and genuine, only when it comes to people worth holding on to. She left 2 days later, taking Juniper and a single satchel. The road back to Willow Bend was muddy with thaw, lined with the skeletal remains of last season's crops. As she rode, old memories pressed close her mother's clipped voice, her sister's laughter, her father's cold eyes. By the time she reached the edge of town, her stomach was knotted with dread. The Hartley house stood as it always had, fine and proud, though the shutters hung crooked and the yard lay unkempt. When she dismounted and knocked, it was her mother who opened the door. Margaret Hartley froze, the color draining from her face. "Clara," she breathed, as if seeing a ghost. "Mother," Clara said evenly, "I heard Father wanted to see me." Margaret stepped aside, her voice trembling. "He's ill. The stress of these accusations." "Clara, they're saying terrible things about us. I imagine they're true," Clara replied. Her mother flinched, but said nothing. Inside, the house smelled faintly of medicine and decay. Her father lay in the parlor, propped up by pillows, his once powerful frame diminished. When his eyes met hers, pride flickered, then shame. "So," he rasped, "the prodigal daughter returns." "I came because I was told you needed me," she said. He coughed, a deep, bitter sound. "I need no one, but it seems my associates have grown bold. They claim I falsified land deeds. Lies. All of it." Clara looked at the papers on his desk: contracts, ledgers, familiar signatures. She had seen enough of his dealings before to recognize deceit when she saw it. "You did it," she said quietly. "You signed land that wasn't yours." Charles Hartley's face hardened. "You've always thought yourself better than this family. But what do you know of survival? Of business enough to know honesty isn't weakness," she said. "You taught me that by example, by showing me what happens when it's gone." Her father turned his face away. "Get out," he muttered. "You were a mistake from the start." The words struck, but they didn't wound as they once might have. Clara only nodded. "I know," she said softly, "and I've spent my life proving you wrong." She left the room without looking back. Her mother stood in the hall, eyes glistening. "Clara, please," but Clara only said, "You could have stopped him." Then she was gone, stepping into the gray light of evening, the air cold but clean. For the first time, she felt no tether to that house, that family, that name. When she reached Monroe Creek 3 days later, the valley was alive with meltwater, the creek rushing wild with new life. Elias was waiting by the gate. The moment he saw her, relief softened his face. "You came back," he said. "I told you I would." He studied her for a moment, noting the tired lines around her eyes, the calm strength beneath them. "You did what you needed to do." "Yes," she said, "and I left the rest behind." They stood there in silence, the sun slipping low over the ridge, the smell of thawing earth thick in the air. Finally, Clara smiled, small but real. "I think the land's healing," she said. Elias's eyes held hers. "Maybe we are too." As the first wildflowers pushed through the melting snow, the past began to fade like frost beneath the morning sun, and in its place, something new, quiet, steady, and alive began to grow between them. By mid-April, the valley was awake again. Streams rushed through the meadows, swollen with melt water. The cattle grazed on new grass, and the first wild lupines painted the hillsides purple. Life returned to Monroe Creek Ranch in small, miraculous ways, like forgiveness growing where grief once rooted deep. Clara rose before sunrise each morning, her skirts brushing against the dew-wet grass as she walked to the barn. Elias was usually there already, checking the animals, humming low and tuneless under his breath. The sound had become as much a part of her morning as the smell of hay and leather. When he saw her that morning, he tipped his hat. "You're up early." She smiled. "The sun was awake before I was. I didn't want to waste it." Elias nodded, looking out at the pink-streaked sky. "Seems the land's making up for lost time." "So are we," she said quietly. He turned to her then, and for a brief moment, his expression softened in a way that made her heart stutter. But before either could speak, a shout came from the ridge. It was Harlan Pike, the old ranch hand, waving his hat as he galloped down the slope. Elias's brow furrowed. He shouldn't be riding that hard unless something's wrong. By the time Harlan reached them, his horse was flecked with sweat. "Elias," he called, dismounting. Trouble at the creek. The north bridge gave out. Floods rising fast. Elias grabbed his coat. "Any cattle trapped, couple dozen, maybe more. We'll need to drive 'em to higher ground before the current takes the fence." Clara's stomach twisted. "Let me come with you." Elias shook his head. "It's too dangerous." "I can handle a rope," she said firmly, "and I won't stay here while you risk yourself." Their eyes locked, his full of warning, hers of quiet defiance. Then he gave a short nod. "Fine. Stay behind me. and do exactly as I say." The storm the day before had swollen Monroe Creek into a roaring torrent. The bridge that once crossed its narrowest point now lay splintered downstream, pieces of timber spinning in the current. Cattle bellowed on the far bank, their hooves churning the mud as the water crept closer. Elias rode ahead, urging his horse through the shallows. Clara followed, clutching the reins tight as icy water splashed against her boots. Harlan brought up the rear, shouting commands over the thunder of rushing water. "Cut the fence on that side," Elias called. "Let 'em through to the rise." Clara dismounted and waded through knee-deep mud, her skirt heavy and soaked. She fumbled with the wire until her gloves tore, but she didn't stop. The cattle pushed past her, lowing in panic, their bodies brushing her shoulders as they stampeded toward higher ground. Clara Elias shouted, "Get back now." She turned just as a section of the bank gave way. The earth crumbled beneath her feet, and she felt herself slide toward the churning water. In an instant, Elias was there, his hand gripping her arm, hauling her up with a strength that left her breathless. For a moment, they stood pressed together, his arm around her waist, the world spinning with cold and adrenaline. "You all right?" he asked, his voice tight. She nodded, breathless. "You pulled me out?" He managed a grim smile. "Wasn't planning on losing you today." When the last of the cattle reached safety, Elias and Harlan secured what was left of the fence. By the time the work was done, the rain had returned thin, steady, cleansing. They rode home soaked to the bone, exhausted but alive. Inside the house, the fire was waiting, its warmth wrapping around them like a blessing. Clara peeled off her wet gloves, her hands raw and trembling. Elias caught them gently, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured. "If I hadn't, you'd still be out there alone," she replied. Their eyes met too long, too close. The air between them felt charged again, alive with something that had been growing all winter. Elias spoke first, his voice rough. "You scare me sometimes, Clara Hartley." She tilted her head. "Why? Because you make me remember what it feels like to care whether someone walks back through that door." Her breath caught. "And is that so terrible?" He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, it's the best kind of terrible there is." For the next several days, the ranch fell back into rhythm. The flood had left its mark, muddy trails, broken fences, but the worst had passed. Spring sunlight gleamed off the wet earth like forgiveness. Elias and Clara worked together from dawn to dusk, mending what the storm had broken. Some evenings, they ate in easy silence. Others, they talked until the fire burned low, trading stories about childhood, dreams, and quiet regrets. One night, as she sketched by the fire, Elias watched her from across the room. "What do you draw when you think no one's looking?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. "Things I want to remember. Things I don't want to lose." He stepped closer, glancing down at the page. It was the view from the porch, the barn, the distant hills, and two figures standing side by side. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost," she said softly. "A home that feels earned." He crouched beside her, his voice low. "And you've given me something I never thought I'd have again. Peace that doesn't feel like loneliness." For a moment, the only sound was the fire's quiet crackle. Then he reached for her hand, rough fingers threading through hers. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm good at this, loving again, but I think I've already started." Her eyes filled with tears, soft and unhidden. "Then you're not alone in that." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met with the gentleness of two people who'd been waiting far too long to be seen. Outside, the creek still rushed from the spring melt, its song winding through the valley. Inside, the fire burned steady and bright, its light flickering over two hearts that had finally stopped running from grief, from judgment, from fear. When they drew apart, Clara rested her head against his shoulder. "So, what happens now?" she asked quietly. Elias smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Now we build something that lasts, and outside, beyond the window." The land itself seemed to echo the promise fields ready to bloom again. A home no longer haunted by silence, and two lives finally learning how to grow together. By late May, Monroe Creek Ranch had turned from frost to green. The fields rippled with new grass, the cattle grazed lazily under the open sky, and the wildflowers that dotted the hillsides swayed like bright confessions whispered to the wind. Clara loved the mornings best when the sun broke across the land like honey poured from heaven, and everything smelled of promise. Each day now carried a soft certainty, the sound of Elias's boots on the porch, the quiet breakfast they shared, the easy laughter that filled the space between chores. Life had become gentle, and she let herself believe it might stay that way. But the world, she was learning, rarely allowed happiness to unfold without testing its strength. One afternoon, as she was hanging linens by the creek, she saw a rider approaching from the road. The horse was a striking chestnut, the rider tall and well-dressed in a dark coat that didn't belong to a rancher. Her stomach tightened with a memory she didn't want. The man slowed as he neared. "Miss Hartley," he called. Her voice caught. "I don't go by that name much anymore." Then Mrs. Monroe. Perhaps his smile was thin, sharp as paper. "I'm afraid I come with news that can't wait." Elias stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His presence alone steadied her heart. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. "State your business." The man tipped his hat. "Russell Dean, sir, lawyer out of Willow Bend. We met before." Elias's jaw tightened. "I remember. What brings you here this time?" Russell's eyes flicked to Clara. "It concerns Miss Hartley's inheritance, or rather, the debts her family left behind." Clara froze. "Inheritance." He dismounted smoothly, pulling a stack of papers from his saddlebag. "Your father passed 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry for your loss. He left the estate in considerable disarray, unpaid loans, unsettled deeds, a few questionable contracts." Elias's voice turned cold. "Get to the point." Russell smiled thinly. "The Hartley holdings have been seized, but your name appears on one of the documents, your signature. To be precise, a transfer of property dated last fall. The bank's investigating. They want to know if you knowingly aided your father's fraud." The words hit her like a slap. "That's impossible," Clara said. "I haven't seen him in months. I never signed anything." Russell's expression was almost sympathetic. "Then perhaps someone signed for you, but I'm afraid the law won't care much for details until it's proven." Elias stepped forward, his presence towering, protective. "You'll not harass her here. If the bank has questions, they'll go through me." Russell's gaze lingered on Clara, cold and calculating. "Then you'll want to be careful, Mr. Monroe. The law can turn quick against anyone who shelters a suspect." Before Elias could reply, Clara spoke, her voice steady, but her hands trembling. "You've delivered your message. Now leave." The lawyer hesitated, then tipped his hat again. "As you wish, but I'll be seeing you both soon." When he rode away, the only sound left was the low murmur of the creek. Clara's breath came shallow and fast. "He's lying," she whispered. "I never signed anything." Elias placed his hands on her shoulders, grounding her. "I know," he said firmly, "and anyone with sense will know it too. But if he has my name, my handwriting, then we'll prove it false," he said. "You're not alone in this." She looked up at him, searching for doubt, but found none. His eyes held only calm conviction. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire long after Elias had gone to bed, watching the flames twist and collapse into embers. Her father's ghost had returned to haunt her, even in death. She'd thought leaving him behind meant freedom, but it seemed his reach stretched further than she ever imagined. When Elias found her in the morning, she was still at the hearth, dark circles beneath her eyes. "Couldn't rest?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "I keep thinking about what he said, about my signature. What if they truly believe I was part of it?" Elias crouched beside her, his voice low. "Clara, I've seen how you carry truth like it's the only thing worth keeping. No one who's known you 5 minutes could believe otherwise." Her eyes glistened. "I wish the world judged by what it knows, not by what it can prove." "Then we'll give them proof," he said. "You still have that ledger from your father's house, don't you? The one you kept?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, it's in the trunk." "Then that's where we'll start." They spent the morning combing through the old book together, pages filled with her father's neat, cruel handwriting, documenting every dishonest deal. Near the back, Clara found a page with her name forged across the bottom of a deed transfer. Her breath hitched. "There it is." Elias leaned closer, studying the ink. "It's a poor imitation," he said. "You loop your letters differently." Clara managed a small, humorless smile. "You've been watching me write." He looked at her, a hint of warmth breaking through the tension. "Every time you sit by that window, sketching, I'd recognize your hand anywhere." Something in the way he said it made her heart stutter, but before she could speak, he stood, tucking the page carefully into his vest pocket. "We'll take this to the bank tomorrow. Set the record straight." The next day, they rode to Willow Bend together. Clara's heart pounded as they entered the small, oak-paneled office where the banker and 2 deputies waited. She felt their eyes on her, heavy with quiet suspicion. Elias placed the ledger on the desk. "You'll find the handwriting on this page doesn't match hers," he said evenly. "And there's proof here that Charles Hartley forged multiple documents long before his death." The banker examined the pages, frowning deeper with each line. This does appear irregular," he muttered. "The signature's been traced, not written." Relief flooded Clara's chest so quickly it made her dizzy. By the time they left the office, the air outside felt lighter than it had in days. The accusations would take time to settle, but the truth had begun its work. As they mounted their horses for the ride home, Elias turned to her. "You handled yourself like someone who's been standing tall her whole life." She smiled faintly. "I've only just learned how." He reached out, brushing his thumb across her gloved hand. "You didn't just survive them, Clara. You outran them." The ride back to Monroe Creek was quiet, peaceful. The sun hung low over the hills, turning the fields to gold. Clara breathed in the scent of sage and spring wind and thought, this is what peace truly feels like. Not the absence of storms, but the strength to stand through them. When they reached the ranch, Elias stopped his horse near the gate. "Clara," he said quietly, "I think it's time we stop pretending this isn't real." Her heart skipped. What isn't? He dismounted, stepping close enough that she could see the faint smile in his eyes. "Whatever this is between us, I've tried to be patient, but patience has its limits." She laughed softly, half teasing, half in awe. "And what would you have me say?" "Only the truth," he said, "because I think we've both earned it." The wind caught her hair as she looked up at him. Then, simply, she said, "I love you, Elias." His reply was wordless, a breath, a smile, a touch that said everything silence could not. And as the sun sank over Monroe Creek, Clara Hartley, once the unwanted daughter, stood on the land that now felt wholly hers, no longer haunted by who she'd been, but defined by who she'd become. Summer settled over Monroe Creek like a blessing. The air carried warmth that clung to the skin and the smell of sagebrush after rain. Days stretched long and golden, evenings cooled by mountain wind that whispered through the cottonwoods. Clara often found herself standing at the edge of the porch in those quiet hours before sunset, watching the fields ripple under the light. Every inch of that land felt alive, familiar: the barn Elias built with his own hands, the fence they'd repaired together, the wildflowers that now grew along the creek's bend. It wasn't just a place anymore, it was home. Inside. Elias was sorting through letters on the table. Since the truth about her father's forgery had come to light, townsfolk had stopped whispering. Some even sent notes of apology, written in uncertain, careful words. Clara read them when she felt strong enough, then tucked them away in a small box. She'd forgiven them all, quietly, long before they asked. "You look far away," Elias said, coming to stand beside her. She smiled, still watching the horizon, just thinking how strange it feels to be at peace. "For so long I didn't believe I deserved it." He leaned against the porch post. "You earned it every step of the way." "You fought for it, Clara?" "Maybe," she said softly, "but I think peace also finds you when you stop trying to prove yourself." Elias reached for her hand, his thumb tracing small circles against her skin. "You've changed this place," he said. "It used to be just a ranch. Now it's a life." Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats drifted from the road. A rider was approaching fast, dust rising behind his horse. Elias tensed, his hand falling to his side out of habit. When the man drew close, Clara recognized him, Sheriff Danvers from Willow Bend, his wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes. "Afternoon, Elias, Miss Hartley." He nodded politely. "Sheriff," Elias said, "what brings you out this way?" Danvers dismounted, his face serious. "It's about Russell Dean, the lawyer." Clara felt her chest tighten. What about him? "He was found dead 2 days ago," the sheriff said. "Gunshot wound near the riverbank. Folks in town are whispering all sorts of nonsense, saying maybe you two had a hand in it." Elias's expression hardened. "That's a damn lie." "I know," the sheriff said quickly, raising a hand, "but lies grow legs faster than truth. I just wanted you to hear it from me first." Clara felt the old fear flicker again, and the fear of being accused, judged without proof. She swallowed hard. "What will you do?" Danvers sighed. I'll clear it up. The man had more enemies than friends. Still, you might want to keep close to the ranch for a while. Let things cool down." Elias nodded. "Appreciate the warning." When the sheriff left, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Clara turned to Elias, her voice low. "It never ends, does it? The past keeps finding new ways to chase me." Elias placed his hands on her shoulders, steady and warm. "The past can only chase you if you turn back to look at it." She breathed out slowly, the tension easing. "I just don't want to bring you more trouble." He smiled faintly. "You brought light. Clara, I'll take a little trouble with it." That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, moonlight spilling across the wooden floor. The thought of being accused again, of losing what they'd built, pressed heavy on her chest. She watched Elias sleeping in the next room, his face peaceful, unaware of her restless thoughts. By dawn, she'd made up her mind. She saddled Juniper quietly and rode toward Willow Bend. If rumors were spreading, she would face them before they grew into something worse. When she arrived in town, people stopped to stare, some out of curiosity, others with lingering judgment. She walked straight to the sheriff's office, her chin high. "Sheriff Danvers," she said. "I came to answer any questions about Russell Dean." He blinked, surprised. "You don't need to be here, Miss Hartley. We know it wasn't you." "Then say it out loud," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Let them hear it. I'm tired of silence breeding lies." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then nodded. He stepped outside, where a few townsfolk had gathered by the hitching posts. "Listen here," he said loudly. "Miss Hartley had nothing to do with Dean's death. Evidence shows the man was killed in a gambling dispute, not on account of any Hartley business. That's the end of it." Clara stood beside him, her gaze steady as the murmurs faded. For the first time, the people of Willow Bend didn't look at her with pity or disdain. Some even nodded respectfully. When she turned to leave, Sheriff Danvers said quietly, "You've got more grit than half the men I know, Miss Hartley." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's not grit. Maybe it's just finally knowing who I am." The ride back to Monroe Creek felt lighter than any she'd taken before. The sky stretched wide and endless, the scent of summer grass rising in waves. When she reached the ranch, Elias was already by the gate, worry written across his face. "I told you to stay close," he said, though his relief was clear. "I did what I had to." She replied, "And it's over now. They know the truth." He let out a breath, shaking his head. "You'll be the death of me, woman. Then I'll make sure it's from happiness," she said, smiling. He laughed softly, pulling her into his arms. "You're impossible, Clara Hartley. Then it's a good thing you like impossible things." Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Elias stood beside her on the porch, watching the light fade over their land. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked quietly. Clara leaned against him, her voice warm. "I think about planting apple trees along the creek, maybe starting a schoolhouse in town someday. I think about peace and work and the sound of laughter filling this place." He looked down at her, eyes full of quiet wonder. "You sound like someone planning a life." "I am," she said simply. "Ours." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved gently through the fields, carrying the scent of sage and the low hum of crickets. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I was going to wait," he said, "but I reckon waiting's cost us enough already." He opened it to reveal a simple gold ring, smooth and unadorned. Clara gasped softly. "Elias," he took her hand, his voice steady, "you've already made this house a home. I'd like to make you my wife, not out of obligation, but because there's no part of this life I want to walk without you." Tears filled her eyes, shimmering in the last light of day. "You already are my home," she whispered. He slid the ring onto her finger. "Then, let's make it official." The sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in gold and violet. The land, once cold and lonely, now glowed with warmth, a reflection of everything they'd built together. In the soft hush of evening, with the scent of new grass and the promise of forever around them, Clara Hartley finally felt the world settle into place. Not as the unwanted daughter, not as the girl sent away in shame, but as the woman who chose her own ending, one written not in sorrow, but in love, and in the heart of Wyoming's wild, endless sky. The story of Monroe Creek became a story of redemption, of quiet courage, and of two souls who found each other when the world had stopped believing in second chances. The family sent the ugly daughter as a joke, but she was what the rancher always wanted is more than a love story. It's a story of courage, of quiet dignity, and of a woman who refused to let cruelty define her. Clara Hartley reminds us that true worth is never found in beauty, wealth, or family approval, but in integrity, compassion, and the strength to stand for what's right, even when it costs everything. And Elias Monroe, the man who saw her not as a burden but as a blessing, teaches us that real love isn't about perfection, it's about recognition. It's seeing another soul clearly and choosing them, flaws and all. If you've ever been misunderstood, if you've ever carried the weight of rejection, remember this: no one else has the right to define your value. And if you've ever lost faith in love, know that it can still find you often in the quietest, most unexpected places when your heart is finally ready to be seen. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey with Frontier Hearts. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us again for more timeless tales from the American frontier, stories of courage, compassion, and the kind of love that endures through every storm.